the Koppelman School of Business webinar on COVID-19 response and recovery for small business and nonprofits in New York City. So I am Dr. Qing Hu, the Dean of the Koppelman School of Business, as a premier public business school in Brooklyn, one of the best public business schools in New York City. Koppelman is committed to serving the community and the city with its distinctive, high quality, and affordable business education, as well as high quality applied business knowledge and research by our world-class faculty associates, and scholars and experts from all over the world. This mission has taken on a very special meaning during the COVID-19 pandemic, which has exacerbated and amplified the social, economic, technical, and political divisions and gaps that have been developing over the last decades. At the same time, the COVID-19 pandemic has created unique challenges and opportunities for business schools. Our faculty have been asking, how can we better serve our community and business in new and innovative ways beyond traditional teaching and research? Today, we have this webinar, which is one of our responses to this challenge. It's first of a series of webinars we will be hosting as one way to help our community defeat the pandemic and plan for the post-COVID economic recovery. So please pay attention to our emails for more webinars on community-focused topics in the future. Today, I am delighted to welcome three exceptionally qualified experts on the topic of COVID response and recovery. I asked Professor Darline Augustine, the moderator of today's webinar, to do a formal introduction of the panelists. Dr. Darline Augustine is an associate professor of business management in the Koppelman School of Business. She received her PhD from the London School of Economics, and she is expert on managing diversity in global economy, strategic management and business policy, entrepreneurship, and community economic development. So now I turn the room to Professor Darline Augustine. Thank you all for coming, and thank you all very much. I hope you will find the time well spent today, and I look forward to seeing you the next time. Darline.
Thank you, Dean Hu. Good afternoon, everyone. May I ask that everyone immediately mute themselves, please? Anyone who's entering, please mute yourselves. Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you so much, Dean Hu, whose support makes these series of webinars a reality for us. Also, I wanted to thank Ketsia St. Armand of the Nonprofit Finance Fund and Global Shapers Queens Hub. Global Shapers is a network that is affiliated with the World Economic Forum. Ms. St. Armand has been a key collaborator with me for these sessions. Also, before we proceed, there are a few housekeeping matters. We are recording this session, please know that. Also, we will take questions at the end. We ask that the attendees place their questions in the chat box. Questions can be directed to a specific panelist or to all the panelists. Today's webinar addresses the COVID-19 policy response and recovery. Not only did COVID-19 create a health crisis, it produced a severe economic shock. Today we have three amazing panelists who took early looks at a novel policy intervention to interrupt the carnage of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Paycheck Protection Program, alternatively known as the PPP. It's a loan program that originated from the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, also known as the CARES Act. The PPP loan is administered by the Small Business Administration, which is a responsible body for overseeing the program and processing loan guarantees and forgiveness. Some quick highlights of the program. It was initially capped at approximately $350 billion. Some of the all businesses with a maximum of 500 employees were eligible. No collateral or personal guarantees were required, no application fee. The interest on the loan was about 1% interest. Provided that the conditions for forgiveness were met, the loan amount could effectively convert into a grant. Needless to say that the funds were rapidly depleted and an additional $310 billion had to be added in the second round. As a result, the PPP was historic in size and speed. Our goal today is to evaluate the PPP program in terms of effectiveness along four broad categories: geographic targeting, effect on employment and rehiring, intermediation of the financial institutions, and addressing issues of racial equity. And we'll get started with the speakers. Dr. Claire Mills is an assistant vice president and director of community development analysis in the outreach education program at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Dr. Kramer Mills leads a team that promotes economic opportunity by equipping community stakeholders with rigorous data analysis and tools to make impact investments. Dr. Kramer Mills initiated a Federal Reserve effort to gather intelligence on the conditions of small businesses, leading to the launch of the Fed's annual Small Business Credit Survey. Last month, Dr. Kramer Mills must be double jeopardy: COVID-19 health and effects in Black communities. A must read. Dr. Joao Granja is an associate professor of accounting at the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago. Prior to that, he was an assistant professor at the Sloan School of Management at MIT. Dr. Granja's research interests included analyzing the relationship between disclosure and financial development, with a focus on examining the way accounting information affects the stability and development of financial institutions. Dr. Granja is an expert on the use of financial statements to evaluate the efficiency of regulated industries. In April, Dr. Granja and his colleagues produced a fascinating preliminary paper entitled, "Did the Paycheck Protection Program Hit the Target?" Amazing that they were able to collect data so quickly to produce that paper. Fascinating. Mr. John Frias is the program manager for the Business Outreach Center for Ascend New York City and the BOC and BDA COVID-19 program. I know you're hearing a lot of acronyms. So clearly BOC stands for Business Outreach Center. MBDA is a Minority Business Development Agency. This agency is within the Department of Commerce, and it aims to promote growth and competitiveness of minority businesses. The MBDA New York City conducted a very early survey in March to examine the impact of the pandemic on its clients. Mr. Frias is currently leading an additional survey preliminary findings. Prior to joining the BOC network, Mr. Frias worked for 10 years at a for-profit education forum in South Korea. Mr. People, ideas, and cultures. Without further ado, we'll get started with Dr. Claire Kramer Mills.
Thank you so much, Darlene. It's really a pleasure to be here today. And I will begin my remarks with a disclaimer, which is that the comments that I make today are my own. They reflect my own views and not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York or the Federal Reserve System. So with that said, I am going to begin presenting. Please let me know if you can see my deck.
So tell them I'm gonna be in class the whole day. Okay.
Okay. So at the onset of the pandemic, we were engaged in a series of sessions with business leaders and business owners in our community, and wanted to really get a handle on how the health crisis was impacting local communities from an economic perspective and a vitality perspective. And what we were hearing, as I'm sure many of you were experiencing and hearing, was that the conditions for small business owners were pretty grave, and they were especially grave in communities of color and in immigrant communities. And we began at that time to explore data more broadly. We started with our own backyard in New York, but looked at national data on businesses owned and operated by persons of color. And at the time that we were asking questions and interrogating what was going on and how we might be able to use our information at hand, Rob Fairley from UC Santa Cruz released an analysis that was published. I would encourage everyone to take a look at that paper. It's quite a telling paper. And the top line finding from that paper was that essentially in the early stages of COVID-19, roughly 41% of businesses, small businesses owned and operated by persons of color, particularly Black business owners, had shuttered. And that was roughly twice the rate of closure of small businesses more generally. And so that's really the topic that this paper and this brief centers on. So we were really interested in that question. And as you can see here, that was a pretty short time period between February and April when those closures happened. And so what we were really centered on in this analysis is the reasons why. And of course, a phenomenon that is that complex is multi-causal. There is not just one simple solution for why these businesses shuttered. And I'm going to walk through a few of the elements that we focus on in this brief. The first was related to Darlene's overview, that PPP did leave significant coverage gaps, and those coverage gaps were particularly acute in places that had been hard hit by COVID-19. And in fact, many of the places, the locations, communities in America that were hardest hit by COVID-19 in the early stages of the health crisis were places that also have higher densities of Black-owned businesses. And then we took a step back to understand some of the drivers behind why PPP might have not, those funds might not have reached the businesses in greatest need. And we leveraged a variety of data sources, including the Fed's Small Business Credit Survey, to really understand what the banking infrastructure looks like and what banking relationships, financial relationships look like in communities of color, areas that were hardest hit by the pandemic. And I'm going to show you some evidence later on in this presentation that suggests that certainly small businesses in general did not have many cash reserves when they were entering the crisis. We're talking in many cases of only a few weeks supply, but in the Black business community, that was exacerbated by the fact that you had relatively less developed banking relationships, weaker banking relationships that could be relied on when those businesses, were seeking PPP funds. So moving on. So here is just an overview. It's a scatter plot on the left that shows a positive, not an overwhelming relationship. It's not a one-to-one relationship by any means. I think our correlation was 0.3 or so. But the data points, the dots that you see in this picture on the left represent counties in the U.S. And what we're showing is the share of firms that are Black-owned and the relationship between COVID case densities by area. And what you see simply on the left-hand side is that there's a positive relationship. On the right-hand side in blue, the dots that are represented in blue depict the share of firms that are white-owned. And what you see here is a different line, a different trend line, which is essentially that there is a negative relationship between density of white-owned firms and COVID cases. Now, zooming out, this is for the U.S. at large. One thing I think that's important to note and that we delve into in greater detail in the paper is that when you look at Black business activity, the activity of small businesses owned and operated by Black Americans, the density is particularly concentrated in 30 counties. 30 counties, the business activity in just 30 counties across America constitutes 40% of sales receipts by all Black-owned businesses. And so those areas we identified in our paper as being places that we should pay particular attention to, because those places, if hit hard by COVID, really could have a huge impact broadly on the economic life chances of Black Americans. And what you see, and what our research shows, is that 2/3 of those counties really were hit particularly hard and were places that had some of the highest densities of COVID cases in the early days of the health crisis. So that's a point that I illustrate here. You see a rate on this graph, exactly where those places are. Probably not surprising, higher concentration in urban areas. You see LA represented, Cook County in Illinois, Chicago, etc. But all of those are available in our brief, and we'll provide the link to that at the end of this deck. So now, taking a quick look at Paycheck Protection Program, what we distill out of those 30 counties, we're depicting the top 10 in terms of Black business density in this table. And so what you see right on the left-hand side is just the total number of Black-owned firms. And here we're using 2012 data, which seems a little dated. The reason we do that is because we have robust information both for employer firms and non-employer firms. It's an important flag here because non-employer firms are roughly 80% of small businesses overall. So these are solo entrepreneurs. They are folks who don't have other employees on payroll, part-time or full-time. Often these businesses do have 1099 types of contract workers that they collaborate with. But in terms of payroll, that's the distinction. And so when I refer to non-employer, that's the type of business that I'm referring to. 80% of small businesses overall are non-employers. That number is roughly 96% in the African American and Black communities. So a very, very high share. And that's an important statistic to flag, because when PPP was rolled out, the first wave of PPP and the first allocation, when they hit go, the first week was authorized for employer firms. Non-employer businesses needed to wait another week in order to apply for the program. So that's just something I think that's very important to note. In essence, employer firms had a running start. In many cases, what I'll show you later is that they also had a running start in terms of their banking relationships. So what you see on the right, essentially what we were trying to do was estimate based on, for these places that had higher concentrations of Black-owned businesses, we are trying to estimate two things. One, what share of firms in general receive PPP loans in these places. And the reason we're not able to specifically understand or calculate what percentage of Black-owned businesses receive PPP loans is that those data were not collected. So our best approximation is trying to understand the relative coverage of PPP for all small businesses. And then we are using the discipline, if you will, of choosing those places that have, examining a deep dive in those places that have more Black-owned businesses. So what you see is that there's variation across even these 10 counties that have the highest concentrations of Black businesses. On the right-hand side, you see a low of 11.6% in Wayne County, and then you go up to 20% coverage. And so on the whole, I think the first thing to note is that you're not talking about a majority of firms in general, and there are some reasons for that, but that even within this group of business communities, the coverage rates varied. Now, why could that be? Part of the reason that many have postulated is that, you had businesses that were potentially not wanting to take on additional debt, that they or debt at all, given the uncertainty of PPP and its duration. I think first, what you see on this page is a comparison of the financial cushion or the financial situation of small businesses at the end of 2019. So every year the Federal Reserve banks collaborate and we do a survey of small businesses, employer and non-employer firms. And this is an estimate of essentially how healthy were those firms financially at the end of last year, right before the pandemic, the onset of the pandemic. And what you see here is a comparison between white-owned businesses and Black-owned businesses, self-reported. And the three characteristics that we're focusing on was the firm profitable? Did it have a relatively high credit score? This isn't a point estimate, they're given ranges. And then a proxy for the cash position of the firm. Was it able to use retained business earnings to keep funding the firm, or was it more debt burdened? And what you see here is that self-reported health approximation, white-owned businesses, 73% said that they were healthy or stable, compared to 42% of Black-owned businesses. Now, going to the point about pipes and what the banking infrastructure looked like. So first of all, in general, I made a point earlier about the liquidity of small businesses being challenged and not in general having many weeks of cash reserves when hit with a loss of revenue. In addition to that, it's also the case that we see are really big differences across the small business community in terms of who has deep relationships with banks, meaning, as we've defined it here, who has received financing for their business from a bank in the last 5 years. And what you see are at the top, the two bars in contrast, that 54% of white-owned businesses had received, and these are those that told us that they were healthy or stable by those earlier metrics that I just presented, compared to only 33% of Black-owned businesses. And so even among firms that we're performing relatively, we're in a relatively similar financial position, you see very big differences in the banking relationships. In contrast, I point your attention to the use of online lenders, online providers of financing. You can think about Square, PayPal, Lending Club, others, Cabbage, and the like. They vary considerably, but just to give you a sense of the types of providers. By contrast, 38% of healthy, stable Black-owned businesses had obtained financing for their firms from a fintech or an online provider in the last 5 years, whereas only 17% of white-owned businesses had. Now, this has implications when going back to the earlier point about the reach of PPP, because in the early waves of PPP, the authorized lenders were those that had been SBA-approved lenders. And by and large, in the initial wave, those tended to be banks. There were some community development financial institutions that had been authorized, and there were, in the late stages of the first round, some fintech or online providers. In the second round, we saw major differences and modifications to the PPP program, where you had more participation by online providers, as well as really ramped up ability for CDFIs, community development financial institutions, and minority depository institutions to play a role in reaching communities that had not been as well served in the early stages of the program. So I'm going to stop here and just provide the link to the brief and look forward to thoughts and questions at the end. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Next, we have Joao Granja.
Right. So I will be sharing my screen now. See, do you? Whoop. All right. So, okay. So thank you so much, Darline, for inviting me to present the findings of my work. So this is basically, as you said, we were able to obtain access very early on to SBA data on the PPP program. So we submitted a Freedom of Information request to the SBA, and to the best of our knowledge, we were only one of the few that basically got accepted right in April. And so basically having access to this early data, we thought that we basically had almost like a responsibility to come up with an analysis, with a policy analysis of the program, in order to inform the public about what are the consequences and effects of the program. So basically the question that we decided to address is basically whether the PPP hit the target. And so there are 3 dimensions to this question. The first one is to ask whether the funds actually flowed to where the economic shock was greatest, during the pre-PPP period, okay? So if you believe that the PPP program was meant to basically avoid mass layoffs and firm bankruptcies, I think it's also reasonable to think that you would expect the funds to basically be flowing to areas with the most pre-policy economic dislocation, as measured by losses in employment, as measured by business shutdowns, and even disease spread. Okay, so this is going to be the first question that we're going to address in the study. The second dimension of this question is that, notably, the program decided to use the banks to basically deploy the funding. And basically, the rationale for that was that everyone thought that the banks were the entities that had the relationships with the small business owners, and they would be better able to deploy the funds in a very speedy way. In practice, I think what all of us have heard is that some banks were very excited to do well for their clients. Some other banks were very slow off the mark in actually responding to the challenges of actually delivering such a large amount of applications and funds in such a short amount of time. Okay, and so it's very likely that, and I'm going to show you some evidence to that effect, that using the banks to basically deploy the program created some inequities in the distribution and allocation of the funds, especially in the first round. Finally, the third dimension of the question that, that we're going to try to address is that we're going to try to understand if the PPP, the target in the sense that actually accomplishing the expected effects, the expected goals of promoting employment and better firm outcomes. So we're going to basically, what we're going to do is basically take the data that we got from the SBA and merge it with a number of data sets that are very highly granular and very high frequency, and that have allowed us to track firm activity over the months of March, April, May, and June. Okay, so, and that will allow us to basically have a sense of whether the program is having any effect in the sense of accomplishing its goals. So the approach is going to be, one, a very descriptive analysis of the program using data. Second, an evaluation of the individual bank performance. Third, a response of the employment and firm outcomes. And fourth, we're also going to be a survey analysis of what are the mechanisms through which the program operating to help firms, if any. So let me show you basically my first finding. Okay, so if you remember, so the first dimension of the question is, did the funds flow to areas that were mostly affected by the pandemic? This is basically the best graph that I have to basically show you the effects, okay? So basically what this graph represents is the following. So we basically partition all the zip codes in the economy into 10 bins based on the percentage of establishments in each zip code that was able to receive a PPP fund, okay? So basically these bins that you have on the left are basically the zip codes where very few businesses have been able to receive the PPP loan during the first round of the program. So here we're focusing on the first round. On the right, we have the bin where we have the zip codes that receive the most PPP loans per establishment in the economy. On the y-axis, we basically obtain data from Homebase, which is a payroll services provider that allows us to basically gauge how many businesses have shut down by late March, okay? The last week of March. And so basically, a business shutdown in the Homebase sample is basically a firm that records 0 hours worked in the week of March 22nd to March 28th, okay? So what is striking from this graph is the following. So the areas, so the collection of zip codes that receive the least fraction of PPP basically have about 30 to 35% of their businesses shutting down in the last week of March. Whereas the areas that actually received the most PPP in April actually had the least businesses shutting down by the end of March, okay? So basically, this is the best evidence that we have to show you that basically the funds seem to, if anything, the funds in the first round seem to have flowed to areas that were actually less hit by the pandemic, okay? We have sort of a similar finding if rather than using a business shutdown metric, we use the total decline in the number of hours worked in businesses located in each zip, okay? And so here what this graph shows you is that the areas that received the least funding saw declines in hours worked of approximately 60 to 66%, whereas areas that basically received the most funding had declines in hours worked of only 50%, okay? Now, the second question that I told you we're gonna look at is what is the role of the banking system in all of this, okay? And so what we're gonna show you really quickly is basically three things. There was significant heterogeneity in the responses of banks across banks. There were some banks that were clearly underperformed, especially during the first round again. and some banks that very outperformed what you would expect from them given their size and regular market share. And then we find something which basically is very important, which is you would think that, well, if one bank basically just underperforms, the borrower can just knock on the other bank's door, on the next door bank's door, and ask for a loan from the other bank that does slightly better. In practice, banks were basically overflowed with applications, and they basically told everyone that, especially in the first round again, that they only going to process the applications of their own clients. So in practice, what happens is that regions with a larger footprint from underperforming banks are going to receive disproportionately smaller allocations of PPP funds. Okay, and this was a problem because that meant that using the banking system as a conduit for the funds basically resulted in dislocations of the funds. Okay, so let me show you really quickly. So what's the idea here? So basically, for each bank, we're going to compare the share of loans that they disbursed in the first round of the program with the share of loans, with a regular share of small business loans that they typically process in regular times. Okay, so basically here JP Morgan processed only 1.4% of loans, but their regular share of small business loans in the market was 10.5%. Okay, so they clearly, according to our metric, they clearly underperformed what would be their natural share of what they should be doing. And so on and so forth, such that the top 4 banks actually account for 36% of the total number of small business loans, but disbursed 3% of all PPP loans in the first round. Okay, so in the second round, some of these wedges basically shrank significantly, but clearly being exposed to these large banks during the first round was not a very good thing. All right, so basically this is the way we're going to operationalize that idea for all banks. Okay, so it's basically we're going to compare the share of PPP of each bank to the regular share of the small business lending market for each bank and compute sort of an index of over or underperformance for each bank. Basically, this tells you, this plot here tells you that the banks that underperformed basically are responsible for 66% of the loans, the small business loans in regular times, but were only able to disburse 20% of the PPP loans in the first round. Okay, so this tells you again that there was significant lender heterogeneity in how they were able to cope with the demands of the program. All right, and this is to show you basically the evolution over time of how banks fared. So again, significant heterogeneity. Smaller banks overperformed, meaning that they had an index greater than 0 over almost the entire timing of the program. Big banks, the top 4 banks and large banks underperformed almost the entire program. In the first round, after the second round, they improved significantly again, but still underperformed according to our metric, right? This is to show you something that there is basically being very much suggested in the media, and I wanted to put some findings and data on this, okay? So basically this tells you that over the program, as the program unfolded, smaller and smaller businesses were able to basically get access to the data. Okay, so banks seem to have prioritized the larger businesses, or an alternative explanation again is that larger businesses were more aware of the program and were able to basically get access to the funds earlier. So it could be a story where larger businesses also were able to basically get quicker access because they were more aware and had better ways to navigate the system than others. Okay. Darline has basically asked me to show you a few plots on the spatial allocation of our measure of bank or over and performance. So what we do basically here is to compute the exposure of each county in the US to bank or over and underperformance by weighting the underperformance of each bank by its respective share of deposits in each county, okay? And so you can, as you can see over here, basically bank areas, very urban areas in the western regions basically did very well in terms, badly in terms of access to the program, whereas areas in the Midwest and in the Northeast did particularly well in access to the program, okay? This is basically the plot for New York City. This is aggregated at the zip level, okay? So, as you can see here, upon Manhattan and parts of the Bronx actually were exposed to banks that did particularly well again. Brooklyn and Queens, not so much. So, it happened to be the case that Queens was exposed to a set of banks that wasn't as good in terms of deploying PPP as banks in Manhattan, okay? Actually, so when we look at this for Chicago, it's very interesting because the South side actually does very well relative to the North side. In New York City, that wasn't the case. You would think that the areas that were less affluent, at least according to what you would expect, actually did worse in terms of their exposure. So basically, remember, I told you that this is super important. So the exposure to over or underperformance basically ended up having a significant impact on companies' abilities to basically access the funds. And this is basically better shown by this plot. So areas in Nevada and Arizona that were in California that were exposed to very bad performance of the banks received very little funding in the round one. Areas in North Dakota, Oklahoma received a lot of funding in relative terms during the round one, okay? Now, finally, let me quickly finalize my comments by showing you the following. Okay, so the third dimension of the program, as I told you, is to basically, of our study, is to try to understand whether PPP funds actually helped communities and businesses in increasing employment and preventing firm shutdowns. So we're gonna what we're gonna do is basically use variation, given that some areas did very well and some areas did very poorly in terms of their exposure to banks that did well or worse. We're gonna basically partition the counties and areas based on whether they were exposed to well or underperforming banks, and then see how they evolve after the program was rolled out, okay? So basically, this is the charts that I have to show you. So basically, using the business shutdown data and the ratio of hours worked data from the home-based sample, we show the following. So it's true that the high PPP areas actually had lower shutdowns and higher ratio of hours worked, but very, very importantly, there's the wedge between the two groups of areas actually appeared prior to the PPP was unfolded, all right? So again, goes back to the lack of allocation, to the lack of targeting of the program. So it was not the case that the areas with the high PPP actually did better after the program was launched, but rather that pre-existing conditions basically are related to the allocation of the PPP funds, okay? And so I think we can see that mostly in those graphs. So if the PPP had any effect, you would expect these two lines here and here to much more widely separate after the launch of the program, okay? The same goes when we basically look for initial unemployment filings at the county level, and when we look at small business revenues that we obtain from the Womply dataset, which basically is a company that processes revenue for small businesses. All right, so basically, again, we see very little separation of the lines after the program is unfolded. So if we don't see any effects on employment, what then? What was the role of the program? And what we find is that using small business census the small business census pulse survey is that what we find is that the program seems to have had some effect in allowing companies to have access to liquidity, to basically obtain precautionary savings, and to basically meet payments, regular payments that they had to meet, that basically allow them to avoid bankruptcy and default, okay? And so basically, this is basically, I'm gonna be very quick on this, but this basically table is basically empirical analysis showing that companies that received PPP were less likely to miss payments, and also reported having more cash on hand to basically withstand the storm, okay? So there's a number of open questions that study wants to address, but hasn't been able to do that yet. And I will leave this for discussion. So basically, with this, I will complete my remarks. I'm looking for all of your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Granja. Mr. Frias, please carry on.
Thank you, Dr. Augustine. I also like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to share our results for our survey and allowing me to be a part of today's webinar. So I'm going to share my screen. Can everybody see my screen? Great.
Yes.
I represent the Business Outreach Center Network of New York. We're a nonprofit organization with a CDFI arm as well, called Bach Capital. And we also manage the MBDA Manhattan office. Being part of this organization and working with Bach Capital, having been a SBA approved lender for the second round, I'd like to echo what my previous panelists have said. Falls in line with a lot of the experiences we've had. After our PPP closed, we at MBDA decided to send out a survey to find out not just how they were affected quantitatively, but also qualitatively, finding out a little bit more about how business owners were not only affected in the numbers, but also emotionally, and how we could help them make it through and be resilient. So without further ado, I'm going to share the survey. So I wanted to start by letting you guys know a little bit about the demographics of the group that we reached out to. First, by industry, most of our industries fell into these top 4 categories, as you can see here: construction, professional services, health services, and food services. The average age of the businesses that we reached out to, more than half of them were 6 or more years in business, and 32% of them were within the 1 to 5 years range. We had 16% that were 1 year or less. The gross revenue of the businesses we reached out to, this is important because it shows that we're reaching out to our particular target, is that most of the businesses were around 250,000 or less in revenue, and over 50% of them, or about 40% of them, were anywhere from $100,000 or less in gross revenue. The number of employees, a large majority of our businesses usually are solo entrepreneurs and businesses with under 4 employees. Now, once again, we wanted to target the major areas of impact that focus not just quantitatively, but also qualitatively. So we focused on revenue loss, and due to the revenue loss, workforce reduction. And because of workforce reduction, trying to stay afloat, how did they change their business operations? We wanted to know what their current concerns are now so that we can try and meet those. And regarding permanent closures with those concerns. So with revenue loss, as you can see the graph on the right, most of the businesses experienced a loss in revenue. About 84% experienced a loss of revenue. 4% actually claimed to be unaffected, and 12% of the businesses that we reached out to experienced an increase, some sort of increase in revenue. Now, we think that's due to a number of reasons. One, some businesses were in an industry that actually was able to benefit from the distribution of PPE or other things that were needed. For example, we have a couple of clients that do facility maintenance, and they've seen an uptick in contracts because of new cleanliness standards. We also noticed that certain businesses were able to pivot more quickly and go from a brick and mortar model to more of a mobile model. So those are the businesses that seem to have experienced an increase. Now, workforce reduction. Interestingly enough, 46% of the businesses claimed that no significant change, but it seems like 54% of the business had laid off people, but 41% of them have not reinstated any employees as of yet, and 13% have reinstated their employees. So the changes in operations, this is really interesting because it shows us how businesses have been able to pivot. Safety policies being their primary concerns, 56% of businesses have adjusted their safety policies, and 48% of those businesses have gone to remote work. 44% have gone to reliance on digital tools. Now, that's also a very key statistic because the businesses that are still struggling right now are businesses that have a how do I say this? A lack of understanding of what options they have with digital tools, or an inability to work with those tools effectively. So that's an issue that I think needs to be addressed. 28% of businesses have gone online. Now, that is really important because it shows that businesses that didn't need websites before are now looking at it as, well, I need to figure out a new way to reach my client base, and have decided to go more digital in that realm as well. So now to the qualitative impacts. So we wanted to know what were the current concerns of business owners. And sure enough, the top concern that they have is their personal financial security. They live off of their business. If their business is sinking, they feel like they're sinking as well. And with that, a majority of the businesses are also worried about how they maintain their client relationships. A lot of our clients deal in neighborhoods that it's important to have a face-to-face interaction, and it's really difficult to do that in these times. Hair salons, for example, are trying to figure out ways to adapt. Let's see. Other businesses that were cash only now are looking at different ways to interact with their clients via online. Another major concern for them is making their payroll. With the loss in revenue, making payroll and paying your debts is a very big concern for them. And with that said, paying rent and mortgages, 48% of our respondents see that as a major concern. Now, I thought that this was really interesting because with regards to permanent closures, a lot of our respondents who did receive PPP loans from us, they don't see permanent closures as a major concern, but there are still 30% of our respondents that are looking at it as a possibility in the next 3 to 6 months. So the point of our survey was to figure out what kind of assistance our businesses in our demographics needed. And we asked them what kind of business guidance they would like. And 70% of these businesses requested help building an online presence. 44% of these businesses wanted assistance on adapting to new safety protocols. 40% of the businesses want training on new digital tools. And 33% of the businesses are looking for assistance in HR management. So what advice do we want to give businesses that are looking to stay resilient? So the first piece of advice I'd like to give businesses out there is keeping good financial records. It's really difficult to participate in programs like the PPP and supply your lender with the correct information that you need to be able to show your eligibility for PPP if these financial records aren't in the correct order. Now, there are lots of ways of doing that. And I'll move on to the next one. Having your documents organized. We were only able to disperse 37% of the people who applied for PPP through us not because they weren't eligible, but because they couldn't provide proper documentation about their business. The articles of organization, they couldn't find them. They couldn't provide us with a P&L or their payroll because they didn't have access to it, or their accountants weren't on a digital platform that made it easy for them to reach. So that leads me to the next advice that I'd give is make sure you understand what technological options you have for these things. I mentioned before that there were restaurants that were cash only.
I was watching Dub Smashes.
And when they were cash only, the reason that they didn't go to using things like Square is because they thought that that would cause them a loss in revenue. So now a lot of them, especially smaller restaurants, have gone to using things like Square and PayPal to be able to charge people via credit card or debit card. Using technology to help you keep your books in order, like QuickBooks or Wave Accounting. These are things that businesses really need to start to learn how to utilize so that they can be ready for any situation that pops up or be able to apply to any other programs that might come down the pipeline. And my last advice is to seek business counseling. We at Bach hold seminars and webinars on a regular basis to try and help businesses do the things that I just mentioned, keeping their financial records, organizing their documents, learning about new tech. One example of that is our partnership with GoDaddy and the Main Street Rise program. There was a program called Empower 1.0 where GoDaddy sponsored a program that allowed us to train businesses on how to create their own websites, and the businesses were able to have GoDaddy websites fully operational by the end of the program and able to use it for a certain amount of time for free. Programs like that are really useful in helping minority businesses in underserved communities be more resilient during the pandemic. If you guys want more information about that, this is my contact information. And you'd be able to reach me at that phone number. If you want my email address, I'll be sure to put it up as well. Okay. And once again, thank you for your time. I'll be available for questions as well.
Thank you very much for the panelists. Clearly, small businesses is very important for our economy. They help diversify our economy, so identifying policies that can help them thrive are excellent. We do have a few questions in the audience. The first question is, goes to Joie. Your study highlights how small business owners and individuals who have relationships and influence were able to avail of the PPP loans at a faster rate as compared to others who lack similar privileges. Can you think of policy suggestions that would help ensure equity and non-discrimination in the allocation of PPP loans?
All right, so thanks for the great question. So, I mean, the first thing that I want to say about this is that I'm going to have to refute the idea that the study shows that the individuals who have relationships and influence were able to avail. I mean, personally, I think it's possible that was the case, but that's not what we find in the studies in a scientific empirical way. Okay, so we don't have any means in the data to show that. The only way we would be able to show that is basically going inside the banks and actually see the order that at which they receive the applications, and basically how they have basically prioritized the processing of those applications given the set of applications that they have available at any point in time. Okay, so I think from a social researcher standpoint, I think it's difficult for me to basically say this. From an individual standpoint, I think there are anecdotes out there on how, especially the large banks, perhaps have prioritized their stronger relationships that basically brings them the most business, which basically it's what incentives say would make sense, right? Now, let's hypothesize that was the case, and so the question is, what do we do about it? That's again a very difficult one. From the moment in which basically we decide to delegate to the banking system the allocation of the funds, sort of we're going to be at the mercy of the bank's incentives to basically process applications, right? And so some ways in which we could basically ameliorate this process is to basically in the process of the program and in the CARES Act have a better targeting of the funds, right? We could basically, for instance, say we're gonna target the funds, specific allotment of funds to this group, or which probably I think should be done, given actually also some of the evidence that John Frias has basically shown us. We probably should target the funds based on revenues. I mean, and basically make sure that they find their way to the small businesses that basically actually receive the most, the greatest hit in terms of revenues and sales that they've been able to generate. Okay. So I think this would be ways to basically reduce some inequities that basically have been created.
Thank you for that clear response. The next question that we have here from the chat is for Dr. Claire Kramer-Mills. The question is, do you think that the issue of Black-owned businesses receiving less funding have to do more with policy or general borrowing tendency of Black-owned businesses in general? If it's policy, what do you recommend could be done differently in order to ensure Black-owned businesses receive PPP funding?
So thank you for the question. And I think that, following the previous panelists' comments, I think at best we can show a correlation. We were pretty careful in our language in our paper, because in a perfect world, what we would want, of course, is really micro level information. We would want to have observations and individual data points from business owners. As John's information was really enlightening. We're in the field right now with a survey that the 2020 version of the Small Business Credit Survey, which will ask at the individual business owner perspective, did they apply for PPP? What did their prior banking relationships prior to that program look like? And that'll give us a little bit better handle on these types of queries. But one thing that I would say is, I think two things are going on. One, we've got longer term secular issues. And when you look at our historical data from our survey, which is, I think, largely corroborated by other evidence from other sources, whether it's census information, JP Morgan Chase Institute has done some great analysis on this as well. You do see differences in Black-owned businesses in terms of, where are they obtaining financing and the likelihood of having, obtained funding from banks. And so we have consistently shown that there are differences between, for instance, white and Black-owned businesses in their propensity to have a prior banking relationship, a lending relationship from a community or a large bank, and a difference in their propensity to borrow from a financial technology company. That has implications, I think, for when you think about, Zhao was pointing out, what pipes are you fortifying when you are allocating significant numbers and amounts of federal funds? You've got to think about what pipes are you equipping to disperse the capital, and where do those pipes go? Where is that money going to land? And we do know that there are differences, for instance, in the financial landscape across communities in America. There are different densities of community banks. There are different reaches of the largest financial institutions. There are different, focal points for community development financial institutions and minority depository institutions. So I think, from a policy perspective, I think, our study and others are suggesting that fortifying multiple pipes and leaving, in some sense, no stone unturned. I think there was good learning, as other commentators have pointed out, between round one and round two. Now, going forward, I think what's interesting, and this is just an observation, is that the PPP was an interesting moment in that in round two, late in round one, and then in round two, there are now approved SBA lenders that were not approved SBA lenders before, Small Business Administration lenders. And what are we going to do with that, right? We are experiencing significant dislocation on the West Coast. We are seeing wildfires out of control. We are looking, if you look at, natural disasters across the U.S., dislocations that profoundly impact communities and profoundly impact small businesses who are employers are recurring. And so I think that, as our financial landscape has changed, we've got to be thinking about, how do we utilize the infrastructure that we've built, and how do we make it more equitable? And I think this is a moment to think about the future pipes that we want to equip.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Kramer-Mills. Another question that came up in chat is now for John Frias. And anyone can jump in as well. It's a very interesting question. The question is, what policy interventions can be put in place to strengthen community development financial institutions to empower them to be the financial intermediary that allocate loans and funds? Should the funds be directly allocated to the CDFIs? Another question also for John Frias along that note, it says in this chat, could you elaborate a bit more on business counseling practices that must be employed, and at what stages?
Okay, so I'm going to address the second question first. As a business counselor at Bach, I have a lot more to say about that. I'm on the ground every day, and since the PPP started, the second round, I was hands-on with my organization deployment of that policy, and it gave me really deep insight into what the major struggles for businesses in our communities are. Technology is probably the biggest struggle in our communities. Lack of access to technology, lack of training on technology. I'll give you a quick example. I had a client who was applying for a PPP. She had all her paperwork. We went through the whole process. I sent her the closing documents and she couldn't close on DocuSign because she had never used it before, right? I was able to help her because we used a social media platform to do a video chat so that she could show me what she was seeing, and I walked her through the process. Again, we weren't supposed to meet anybody in person, so we had to be creative. What that tells me is that more funding needs to go to CDFIs to do more technological training, to train businesses, not just in using work tools like Zoom or, but more how to use technology to streamline their process, to reach new groups, and to increase their efficiency, specifically around keeping financial records. So another big issue that we had with the PPP is a lot of business owners, they didn't have their taxes ready. They didn't have their payroll ready. They didn't have access to those kinds of things because they maybe worked with local accountants who have been doing it for 30 years and have been doing it for the same way for 30 years. And because of that, they don't keep digital copies of their taxes. So it isn't as simple as sending an email. Whereas other firms in different locations that might be the norm for them now. It's not in our communities. So to answer your question about what can be done with regards to CDFIs and how to help businesses, I think more programs that train people on how to use these digital tools. I think our GoDaddy program was super successful. A lot of the businesses came out of that didn't have a website, now have a website, and now are able to do e-commerce, and now are able to reach their clients that they weren't able to reach before. And the way I see it is once this pandemic is over and we go back to business as normal, that is going to stay. They're not going to get rid of that. And that's going to help them expand and grow. Now, to the first question, what type of policies and should the funding be sent directly to CDFIs? I think what Zhao and Claire have been showing in their presentations is that the CDFIs have a more intimate relationship with the community that needs it the most. And because of that, they're the ones that should be administering these types of programs, especially during natural disasters. I mean, Claire mentioned what's going on in California right now. And now the CDFIs are the SBA lenders that they weren't before. They could be the conduit to really reach to the community directly. The banks are more focused on helping their clients, and as they should, right? They're there to assist the clients that they have a relationship with, and our job as CDFIs is to help these businesses grow and be stable and sustainable so that they can be clients of these bigger banks. And then that's how I see the cycle happening. I mean, Claire, Zhao, if you want to jump in on that.
You know, John, I want to ask you a question. I think you made a really interesting observation, which is that, so many of the communities and the entrepreneurs in the communities that you're serving would really benefit from the hands-on help that you all can provide. In order to scale, though, if you look at, there was an observation in the comment box about, the percentage of the market that CDFIs serve. I think in a way, it's to focus on the percentage, in a way misses the point, which is that these are the communities in deepest need, right? And so it's not a volume play; it's really a qualitative, right, play. But my question is for you. I think you've underscored and kind of build off the point that I flagged with natural disasters. In order for CDFIs themselves to play that amplified role, what needs to happen for CDFIs? And I think the question was postulated: is it money? But I'm curious, what else do CDFIs need in order to kind of expand their role and meet the very, very large challenges?
So, I happen to work for a very well-organized organization. I can't speak on other organizations. What we would need at BAC would be more funding to be able to attract more talent that is dedicated to the mission. One of the difficult tasks of CDFIs, especially for BAC, is that we're a nonprofit organization, right? So the talent is, whether it's from our communities or outside of our communities, the talent is going to go where they're going to get the most return for their work, right? We're a special group at BAC. I think we have about 50, 60 employees, and we're all dedicated to the mission of what we do. And that's why we're here. So if I were to say, what do CDFIs need? It would be more financial resources to attract more talent to be part of the mission. And backing from the SBA would be great.
So I can jump in, and also I will probably have a little bit of a contrarian take. So the one thing that I think it's crucial is that it's in order to deploy the funds to basically where they are needed the most. What we need to make sure is that the institutions that have the relationships with those firms, with those small business borrowers, actually are allowed to get access to the funds, okay? So we cannot have, in my mind, what we cannot have is basically a situation where a CDFI knocks on the SBA door to basically try to process an application, and it finds a log jam, okay, which is not there for the top 4 banks or for the large institutions, okay? So in my mind, first of all, we need to direct the funds to where they need the most, and then we need to let the financial institutions, including CDFIs that have the relationships to those companies and firms that need the most, to be able to basically quickly deploy those funds. To me, so at some point during the second round, basically the act that basically allocated the additional funds during the second round basically set aside 60 billion to be deployed through the smaller banks. In my mind, that wasn't really necessary, right? I mean, what we really needed is that, provided that a small company knocks on the door of the bank, that first the bank is able to basically go to the SBA and quickly process this application. All right. So to me, that's much more important than directing funds to particular sorts of institutions, because that will basically entail a trade-off. The trade-off would be, if now we are only going to process the PPP through CDFIs, given the immense scale of the program, clearly the CDFIs are going to be completely overwhelmed in very little time. Okay, so I think I would basically be a little bit more cautious with how we basically discuss this issue.
Oh, I agree with that. Like I said, I just happen to work for a very well organized organization. I know that not all the CDFIs are at the scale of what BAC is. And I think my colleagues could also speak on the fact that, I mean, banks are mandated to give a certain amount of funds to minority firms as well. I definitely agree that there could be a logjam. I think I saw in the chat box there was a question about fraud, and I can see your point, Zhao, that if there is a logjam or if there's a CDFI that's not organized enough to be able to handle the immense scale of the policy, that things like that could happen. So I do agree with that as well. But maybe that's also, to Claire's point, what a CDFI needs to be able to build the infrastructure to be able to handle things like that.
Great. We have time for one more question, and I want to make sure that it gets in because this person asked early on. This question is to Joao Granja, Dr. Granja, once again. The question is, what would you recommend the banks to do differently that it would ensure that Black-owned businesses receive more funds? Example, what would you recommend they do that they act as a more effective conduit?
Mm-hmm. That would be, that's a very, very difficult question. I think basically it goes to the crux of what are the bank's objectives and how, what should they prioritize, okay? And so, I mean, obviously, when we think about nowadays, more and more we have a push for companies to think about social responsible goals in their objectives. And so, given that, I think we would hope that banks, including the very largest ones, to basically have that sense and at least try to equally prioritize minority-owned businesses, female-owned businesses relative to other types of businesses. Now, obviously, given that we decided to use the current banking system, not our ideal banking system, as the conduit for funds, and given that we're entering the private sphere of the banks, it's very difficult basically to impose those sorts of incentives and objectives and rules, right? So it's basically, I mean, it's up to the banks to basically decide to do that on their own, unfortunately. The other option would be to basically directly administer through the Small Business Administration the funds, or even through the IRS. But that is also going to be there's going to be trade-offs implied in that, right? Once again, if we're going to do this through the IRS, I think there's going to be a decline in the speed of delivery. And if you guys well remember, in the first few weeks of April, there was a clear sense of panic and urgency.
Yes.
Okay. So, yes, that would be an option. And then we could basically direct the government to basically steer the funds to specific types of businesses, or the policymakers could try to do that. But I think that would be at the cost. And I don't have any evidence supporting this, but that would be at the cost of the speed of delivery. Actually, there's actually some little evidence on this, which is the fact that the Emergency Law and Disaster Program, the EIDL program, was deployed at the same time, and is actually governed and administered by the SBA itself. And as you look basically at the timing of when most of these loans under this program were actually disbursed, they actually lag those of the PPP by a few months, okay? And so this basically, I mean, I don't want to read too much into this piece of evidence, but it could definitely suggest that the SBA was somewhat slightly slower in how they basically process these loans due to capacity constraints of their staff. Okay.
Great. Thank you. We have 5 minutes left. We may have time for one more. I know Ms. Jency Joni, you had a question for the panelists. Did you want to ask it now? You may unmute yourself.
Yes. Thank you, Darline. First and foremost, I wanted to thank Claire, Hua, and John for a truly fascinating session. I learned a lot about the ground reality of PPP, listening to your comprehensive takes on the same. My question, in fact, is for all speakers. How widespread and pervasive was the issue of malpractice and fraud when it came to the allocation and disbursement of PPP funds? So, do you have any statistics or research to account for this?
I can start off, I don't mind. I think John probably will have given his being on the fact that he's on the field, he will probably have a more interesting take. I can tell you from my perspective that this is very much something that I will be interested in studying from a scientific and data-driven perspective, but this is not something that it's possible to get data as of yet. So I think, yes, we're all have already seen anecdotes on that there's going to be fraud eventually. I have basically my take is that I have not yet anything to tell you on that. Basically pay attention to the next chapter of the paper. Hopefully we'll be able to, at some point in the studies, basically to say something about that.
So, thank you, Zhao. Having played a role in my organization's distribution of the PPP, I was actually hands-on on almost every client application. I don't have statistics, as Zhao pointed out. It's too early to have statistics on the fraud. But I do know this. Our director of lending asked us and all of our counselors to collect way more backup data from each business than was required by the SBA. So, for example, for sole proprietors, you only really had to have a Schedule C and a DBA, and then you'd be able to be eligible. And there are a lot of other institutions that were just using that. For C Corps, you just needed to have a payroll form from Paychecks, and your business certification from the state saying that you were a C Corp. So we asked for way more than that. We wanted to see 2019 taxes. We wanted to see your payroll. We wanted to see your first 2 months bank statements to make sure that you were still in business up until February 15th. So we at BAC, through order of our director of lending, were wary of people trying to take advantage of the program who were not eligible for the program. And we did our due diligence to eliminate that as much as possible. In fact, I can tell you right now that there were at least 4 that we flagged as like, no, we're not doing them. So is there fraud? Probably. Do we have statistics on it? No. Did we do our best to mitigate the possibility of fraud? Yes. To the point where some of our potential clients who requested loans from us were very upset with us because we kept asking them for a lot of documentation that Cabbage wasn't asking for or PayPal wasn't asking for. And there was a lot of resentment from certain groups that would call and be like, well, why are you asking for this? And it's like, we're asking for it because we need to show that you are a legitimate business and that you are struggling because of this pandemic and no longer can work. And then we'll process the payment. So we won't know for a while until we start doing forgiveness, I think, when we start seeing people reporting and people giving us their statements showing how they spent the money, how much fraud there actually is. But my guess is for us that there isn't that much, because we really put people through the ringer. It's probably another reason why we only were able to give 37% of our applicants PPP loans.
Great. Well, this concludes our panel. Thank you so much to the panelists. You were amazing. Nothing pleases me more when I see research having real impact on the real world. So thank you for all the great work that you're doing. This research is certainly very useful for how we think about policies for the future. Thank you so much, panelists. Have a great afternoon, and we'll be in contact. This now officially ends our webinar.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for your wonderful panelist service. And we're looking forward to have another round down the future. And we're very happy to use your expertise to serve our community.